Welcome to Fables Lesson 14. Today we're going to read the last chapter in the Fabled Fourth Graders, and it's called Mr. Jupiter Takes the Fifth. On the last day of school, Mr. Jupiter's students cleaned out their desks. They tossed out pencil nubs, gum wrappers, half-empty glue bottles, and tests with bad grades. "Oh, look!" Missy suddenly shouted. "I found my mittens!" She pulled out 36 pairs of black knitted mittens. "Oh, gross," moaned Rose. "I found that first-class picture." "Oh, joy!" cried Ham. "I found a green jelly bean." He popped it into his mouth just as Humphrey said, "That's not a jelly bean. That's a moldy piece of tofu from one of my salads." Ham smacked his lips. "It was still good." "I bet you're going to be sick," said Emberly. "I bet you're going to puke the whole first week of summer vacation and not be able to go to the swimming pool." "That's okay," said Ernest. "You can always stay home and crochet with me." "Pfft," said Rachel, but nobody heard her. "Yikes," said Jackie. "I hope I don't catch it. I catch everything, you know. Baseballs, basketballs, frisbees." "Get serious," snorted Stanford. "You can't catch food poisoning." Mr. Jupiter clapped his hands. "It's time to collect the textbooks. Please pass your spelling manuals to the front." Amisha handed hers forward. "Goodbye, old friend," she whispered. "Now your math books," Mr. Jupiter said a few moments later. Calvin handed his forward. "Goodbye and good riddance," he whispered. "And now your organic geochemistry books," Mr. Jupiter finally said. "Hey!" cried Melvin. "I never got one of those." The others ignored him. "Is everyone's desk finally empty?" asked Mr. Jupiter. "Mine is," said Lil, and she waxed poetic. "Oh, empty desk, once full of books, now full of air, you sit forlornly, waiting for next year." The sadness of her poem touched the other students. Gloomily they looked around at the classroom's bare walls and empty shelves. Mr. Jupiter had already taken home his collection of meteorites and Mexican jumping beans. He'd packed up his Tibetan prayer wheel and his Mongolian camel saddle. He'd even hauled away his army ant farm and his anaconda skin. Now the place was merely a shell of its former self. "I feel sort of sad," said Calvin. "Me too," said Bernadette. Now, said Mr. Jupiter. "It may be the last day of school, but it's the first day of summer. Who has exciting plans?" Ham's eyes sparkled with happiness. "I'm spending 2 weeks with my grandparents in Hershey, Pennsylvania." "I'm going to modeling camp," said Victoria. "I'm getting my own subscription to International Geographic," said Lenny. "What are you doing, Mr. Jupiter?" Ashley B. asked. "I will be embarking on the greatest adventure of my life," he replied. "What's that?" asked Jackie. "Touring America's baseball parks?" "No," said Mr. Jupiter. "I'm going to Mars." "Mars?" the children gasped. Mr. Jupiter continued. "I've been invited by the International Space Academy to help establish a colony there. I'm hoping to open the first interplanetary elementary school in history." "Wow," said Ashley Z. "That's a lot for one summer." "Actually," said Mr. Jupiter, "I'll be on Mars for years." He paused, then added, "Today is my last day at Aesop Elementary School." "No!" cried Missy. "It can't be true," wailed Emberly. "Now I feel really sad," sobbed Calvin. Stanford raised his hand. "But who's going to be our teacher next year?" he asked. Everyone knew that the fifth grade teacher had decided to retire early rather than to teach the upcoming class. "Yes, who?" repeated Humphrey. "I don't know," said Mr. Jupiter, "but I'm sure your new teacher will be a caring, loving person who will recognize each and every one of your unique qualities." At that moment, Miss Turner, the librarian, breezed into the classroom. "Why so gloomy?" she asked when she saw the children's faces. "Mr. Jupiter's leaving us," blurted Rose. "He's going to Mars." The color drained from Miss Turner's cheeks. "But who will teach the children?" she asked. The classroom door burst open, and in stalked a man dressed entirely in black and carrying a mysterious leather satchel. He glowered at the children from beneath bushy gray eyebrows, and Mr. Jupiter turned as white as his whale-tooth necklace He ducked behind Miss Turner. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. "Shh!" whispered Mr. Jupiter. Miss Turner lowered her voice. "What's going on?" "I've stood at the edge of an erupting volcano," Mr. Jupiter whispered frantically. "Swung through shark-infested waters, survived an attack of killer bees, but there's still one thing that strikes fear into my heart." "My name is Herman Kinderschmacker," growled the man. "And he's it!" squeaked Mr. Jupiter. He stuck his head under Miss Turner's cardigan. "I will be your 5th grade teacher," Mr. Kinderschmacker continued. He smiled menacingly. "And I have ways of making you behave." Rose gulped, Rachel gasped, and Mr. Jupiter whimpered. The sound made Mr. Kinderschmacker turn. "Who's there?" he demanded. "Come out at once." On legs that were weaker than Calvin's math skills, Mr. Jupiter stepped out from behind the librarian. "Hi there, Mr. Kinderschmacker." He tried to sound nonchalant. Well, well, if it isn't my old student, Harry Valentine Jupiter," growled Mr. Kinderschmacker. Mr. Jupiter tried to smile. "Where's your homework?" snapped the 5th grade teacher. Homework?" squeaked Mr. Jupiter. "It's been 25 years since I've been in your class. I don't remember any homework." "I do," snarled Mr. Kinderschmacker. "You never turned in your final math assignment. We were studying decimals." He took a step toward his former pupil. "What do you have to say for yourself, Harry Valentine?" Mr. Jupiter searched his mind for any excuse. Any excuse. Would you believe I lost at fighting this kid who said you weren't the best teacher in the school?" he stammered. "Hey, that's my excuse," said Lenny. But Mr. Kinderschmacker sneered. "I never believe anything my students tell me. You know that." And he snapped open his satchel and pulled out a 5th grade math book. At the sight of it, Calvin almost fainted. "You will do page 58 now!" thundered Mr. Kinderschmacker. But, began Mr. Jupiter. "No buts," warned Mr. Kinderschmacker, "or else." Mr. Jupiter yelped, grabbed the book, and sat down at his desk. As he struggled with the first 257 math problems, Mr. Kinderschmacker turned back to the students. "In my classroom you will work," he barked. "Not only will you be expected to copy each of your spelling words 500 times a week, but you will be required to turn in 100 book reports a month and do 6 hours of homework each night." He looked around the room. "Any questions?" "Will we tell jokes?" asked Lenny. "Absolutely not." "Will we get snacks?" asked Ham. "Never." "Will we be given time to crochet?" asked Ernest. "Don't make me laugh." Missy turned to Rose. "I don't think you could laugh," she whispered. "Stop that jibber-jabber at once!" roared Mr. Kinderschmacker. "Hey," said Humphrey, "you can't talk to us like that." "I certainly can," replied Mr. Kinderschmacker. "I'm the teacher. Now everyone shut your mouths and lay your heads on your desks. You will remain that way until the end of the day." Meekly, the children put their heads down. "But Mr. Kinderschmacker," said Miss Turner, "may I remind you that there are still 4 more hours of school?" "Silence!" shouted the new teacher. "Do as I said." Meekly, the librarian put her head down too. Soon the room grew quiet. Only the sound of Calvin nervously chewing on his pencil broke the silence. Then Rachel began whimpering so loudly that the others could almost hear her. Stanford began blithering like an idiot. Victoria began miserably picking at her new French manicure. Lil began mumbling a dirge, and Ham complained about loss of appetite. All this noise forced Mr. Jupiter to look up from his decimals. What he saw shocked him. Lenny and Bruce were clinging to each other, and they looked terrified. "No!" screamed Mr. Jupiter. Leaping to his feet, he swept the math book on the floor. It landed with an explosive BAM! "That's a month's detention for you, Harry Valentine," snarled Mr. Kinderschmacker. Mr. Jupiter suddenly felt courage coursing through his veins. It reminded him of when he had wrestled a crocodile on the banks of the Nile River. He lifted his chin. "No," he said, "it's not." "Sit down," commanded Mr. Kinderschmacker. Mr. Jupiter squared his shoulders. "No," he said, "I won't." "This is my class now," hissed Mr. Kinderschmacker. Mr. Jupiter stood tall. "No," he said, "this is my class, and these are my students." The children raised their hands. "But what about exploring Mars?" they asked. "And establishing an interplanetary school?" asked Miss Turner. Colonization of Mars can wait, Mr. Jupiter replied, but my students can't. Mr. Kindersmacker growled. I intend to speak to the principal about this. It won't do any good, said Mr. Jupiter. She likes me better. Mr. Kindersmacker growled again. You were always a troublemaker. Stuffing the math book back into his satchel, he strode towards the door. But before crossing the threshold, he turned. I'll be back, Harry Valentine. Mark my words. I'll be back. Then he was gone. All the almost fifth graders clapped and cheered and leaped from their seats, surrounding their teacher. Bruce was so happy he hugged Mr. Jupiter. Jackie was so happy she hugged Mr. Jupiter. Stanford was so happy he shook Mr. Jupiter's hand. Then everyone took turns hugging Mr. Jupiter or shaking his hand. Everyone, that is, except Miss Turner. She took the opportunity to plant a kiss on Mr. Jupiter's cheek. You're a good man, Harry Valentine, she said. Mr. Jupiter blushed, and Lenny suddenly whooped. Fifth grade, here we come! Yes, indeed, said Mr. Jupiter, and it's bound to be an adventure. And that is the end of the Fabled Fourth Graders.